The Ypres salient in Belgian Flanders, the most notorious and dreaded place in all of the First World War, probably of any war in history. Rumours of what awaited the men there disturbed everyone. From the autumn of 1914 to the autumn of 1918, Flanders was in effect a gigantic killing field. Hundreds of thousands died there for ground where gains was measured in mere yards. It was where in 1914 the British professional army was virtually annihilated. It was where in 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, Germans introduced the hideous novelty of poison gas in a battle they codenamed Operation Disinfectant. And if anyone at this time still had any idea left about war being a chivalrous duel, this would surely disinfect them of that notion. Ypres was where the flamethrower, that horrifying symbol of industrialised war, made its dreadful debut. It was where in 1917, during the most infamous battle of the war was fought, the Battle of Passchendaele, where thousands fought and drowned in mud, sometimes waist deep. It was where in 1918 a massive German spring offensive threatened to undo everything the Allies had so bitterly fought to gain. But then, in an electrifying turnabout, the ground was retaken and the final unravelling of the German war machine began. It was said you could smell the battlefields of Ypres miles before you even reached it, where the smell of thousands of unburied bodies were rotting out in the open, in which hordes of rats made their hovels, and where thousands of men's excrement and the lingering smell of poison gas filled the air. In short, it was hell on earth. And it was where we get one of the most enduring symbols of World War I, the symbol of the poppies that grew in Flanders fields. So let us begin our story on the 13th of September 1914, where the so-called race to the sea began. The First Battle of the Marne had just been fought, and the Germans had been pushed back from Paris in a heroic stand by the French and British. They now occupied new defensive positions on the heights behind the river Aisne. During the night of the 13th, the BEF crossed the Aisne in pontoon boats, attempting to dislodge the Germans from their newly established positions. There was a heavy fog concealing their crossing during the night, which would work in their favour. But as daylight rose and the fog began to burn off, the BEF would find themselves totally exposed. With very little cover, the Germans would slaughter the British with artillery and machine guns. One of the more notable first-hand accounts from this event comes from a Lieutenant Colonel John Bacon, who at the time was serving as a staff officer in the BEF. Quote, "The advance was a succession of terrible moments. The British line would press forward, but the German artillery had such a range and their fire was so well aimed that the men had no chance. The slaughter was on a scale we had never imagined. The ground was littered with the dead and wounded. For hours the men were pinned down in the open, unable to advance or retreat, facing death from all directions." End quote. The British limped back across the river and are ordered to dig in by their commander Sir John French. And this is the time that is often referred to as the commencement of trench warfare. Both sides still had hopes of victory though, moving spare units out of the lines in areas where the situation had stabilised and rushing them north. During the first stages, the BEF remained dug in behind the River Aisne, while the French and the German forces engaged in a bloody series of encounter battles as they leapfrogged to the north. This for a long time has been called the race to the sea, but is a bit of an oversimplification of what was going on here, and that the intention was who could get to the sea first. It was really a series of outflanking manoeuvres, with both sides pushing their men to the brink, marching farther and striking harder in a desperate bid to outpace their enemy, encircle them and sever their access to critical supply ports and rail hubs. Some of the notable battles during this race northward would be the Battle of the Aisne, Battle of Ypres, Battle of Arras, Battle of La Bassée, Battle of Armentières and the Battle of Messines. These battles showcased the transition from mobile warfare to static trench warfare, and revealed the stalemates that would dominate the Western Front for years. Back down on the Aisne, Sir John French of the BEF was becoming frustrated with his entrenched position, as he had been a mobile cavalry commander in the past, and he sent a request to Joffre to move his army to the north and take up station on the left flank of the French, which would greatly facilitate the supply arrangements via the channel ports back to the motherland. Thus, the BEF would become involved in the final operations around northern France and around Ypres, where it would try to exploit or defend the last possible gap before the North Sea stopped any further opportunity for outflanking manoeuvres. As the race to the sea neared its climax, the BEF and the French 2nd and 10th Armies would become part of a hastily assembled Northern Army group, all under the control of the feisty figure of General Ferdinand Foch. Behind the British lay the vital channel ports of Dunkirk, Calais and Boulogne, lifelines that had to be held at all costs, and the Germans knew it. If they could seize those ports, they wouldn't just push the British off the continent, they would strangle the Allies, severing the British's ability to reinforce and resupply. But firstly, the Belgians on the right flank of the Germans, held up in Antwerp, needed to be dealt with. Enter General Hans Hartwig von Bessler, an old-school Prussian siege expert, who on October the 1st ordered an all-out assault on the fortress city of Antwerp. The city's ring of forts, once thought to be formidable, had already been exposed as fragile during the opening days of the war under the weight of the German super-heavy artillery. The massive Big Bertha guns, monstrous 420mm howitzers, made short work of the Belgian defences. And by October 9th, Antwerp had fallen. The remnants of the Belgian army, battered but not broken, fell back in disarray behind the river Yser, the last natural barrier standing between them and total annihilation. Then, on October the 18th, the Germans renewed their offensive, launching a ferocious assault near the coastal town of Nieuport. By the 22nd, they had forced crossings over the Yser, and by the 24th, the situation reached a crisis point. The Germans attacked furiously, hammering the Belgian lines with at least 15 major assaults, trying to blast the path through to the channel ports. Now, this part of Flanders sits below sea level. It is a land reclaimed from the sea by generations of Belgians who built dikes and tirelessly pumped water out to keep the ocean at bay. But now, with the front teetering on the brink, King Albert I of Belgium made a decision as desperate as it was devastating. They would blow these dikes and let the seawater in. Now, this was a fertile region, a breadbasket of Belgium, and by unleashing seawater, they were effectively salting their own earth. You probably heard the ancient Roman expression about salting the fields of their enemies, rendering the land barren for generations. Well, here the Belgians did it to themselves. And the result? A massive, impassable floodplain stretching nearly 3 kilometres wide at points and reaching as far south as Dixmude. The wall of water slammed the door shut on this part of the front, making it impossible for the Germans to push through. So just as the entire front looked to be solidifying from Switzerland to the North Sea, the chief of the German General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, would make one last desperate attempt to break through the lines and win the war in 1914. In the end, the main attention would fall on Ypres, a small market town in Belgium. Ypres had no particular value in itself, but it was the gateway to success for both sides. For the Germans, it offered a way through to the Channel ports, and for the British, a route to Menin, Roulers, and the chance to cut German rail communications. Falkenhayn moved up his 4th Army under Ulrich, Duke of Württemberg. This was a massively newly constituted formation, containing the 22nd, 23rd, 26th and 27th Reserve Corps, manned mainly by half-trained wartime volunteers and conscripts. The only experienced troops were the 3rd Reserve Corps, which had been responsible for the capture of Antwerp. Under Falkenhayn's plan, the new 4th Army, assisted by the more northerly elements of the 6th Army, would have smashed through the thin trench lines scratched into the ground by the French and British and Belgian units. This was a risky move, as the quality of these troops were nowhere near the original quality of the troops they had back in August 1914. I know that is weird to say back in August 1914 here, when that's only a month or so ago. But to take a quote from someone who would make a name for himself toward the end of this war by the name of Vladimir Lenin. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. A lot of the men thrown into the battle here were students, whose teachers had indoctrinated them into the idea that this is what you do, and you fight for Germany, and what a great honour it's going to be. And they would all join up together with their fraternity badges and with stars in their eyes and tales of glory in their hearts. And after very little training, and due to Falkenhayn still desperately trying to win the war early, he threw these young, undertrained and underskilled boys into battle against what might have been the most well-trained and well-versed soldiers in the world at this point, the grizzled veterans of the BEF. Winston Groom, in his book A Storm in Flanders, writes of the event, quote, On a front of nearly 20 miles, tens of thousands of men came to grips and did their best to murder each other in the cold, dank, misty hills surrounding Ypres. In many places the fighting was hand to hand. That morning, division generals of the German Fourth Army, consisting in large part of students, attacked the British line such as it was. In a fit of Wagnerian frenzy, the German students came on, arm in arm, and were waving their rifles in the air, singing, and with their spiked pickelhaube helmets, festooned with flowers, by the thousands they were shot down. Even though they outnumbered the British at times 6-1 that morning, they faced the most professional and elite regiments of the British Army, if not the world. The Black Watch, Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, Cameroons, Grenadier Guards, Irish Guards, Staffords, Gordon Highlanders, Green Howards, Royal Scots Fusiliers, Welsh Fusiliers, and others almost too numerous to mention, including the Hussars and the Dragoons of the Cavalry Corps. When it was all over, the British official history estimated that at least half of these youthful Teutonic warriors, 100,000 of them, had been shot down. The Germans named the battle the Massacre of the Innocents. End quote. The German troops managed to break into the enemy trenches in places, but counterattacks drove them back. In one area, a British battalion saw what it thought was a wave of German soldiers standing strangely still through the fog and smoke. For some time the British watched, until the fog cleared, to reveal what they saw was not living Germans, but a bank of dead ones. By the end of October, writes war historian John Keegan, the wider German offensive had failed, at enormous cost. There was a German cemetery at Langemarck where the bodies of 25,000 student soldiers lie in a mass grave. Sculptures by the artist Käthe Kollwitz dominate the scene, depicting a mother and a father mourning their lost son, herself suffering the loss of a child at this battle. I wanted to get some first-hand accounts from the German soldiers' point of view at this battle. There isn't a lot out there in English, but Jack Sheldon has done a wonderful job compiling some of these in his book, The German Army at Ypres, 1914. This is a gripping account from a Kriegsfreiwilliger of the 9th Company who was pinned down in a turnip field.
Ich war völlig erschöpft und müde.
I felt a sense of utter fatigue and exhaustion. I was barely able to pull a few beets out of the ground. I bit into them and can still remember their earthy taste. We crawled on, the hedges and houses looming up out of the dark background. We could see the flash of the rifles and the machine guns. On your feet! Double march! We made some progress, but the majority were hit. To the rear were burning buildings. I looked around and saw 2 men still on their feet. We threw ourselves down and pressed our faces to the cold earth. There was an eerie rustling in our ears. It was the sound of bullets cutting through the leafy tops of the beets. I scraped a hole for my face with my bare hands, then began to return fire. Beside me an old officer groaned and pressed his hand against his body, as though he could reduce the intense pain of a stomach wound by doing so. To my rear, a second assault wave was launched forward. It did not even get level with my position. All I could hear were the screams and the groans. A third wave threw themselves to the ground to my front. Achtung! Go! Dear God, thy will be done. On your feet, go! 10 metres further on, the entire wave was mown down, a mere 50 metres from the enemy. Close to me, someone was screaming out loudly, but I was such a coward I could not bring myself to go to his aid. An Oberjäger kneeled by him and bound him up in the midst of a torrent of fire. That shook me into action. I too kneeled up and offered him the contents of my water bottle, the last I had. On your feet, go, go! As I hauled myself up, something heavy knocked me back down, and the leading Oberjäger who had been so helpful was also hit. I felt him go stiff in my arms. I do not know how long we were lying there. Off to one side, a vermin prayed the Lord's Prayer out loud, adding in several prayers of intercession. End quote. Could you imagine yourself for a moment as a young German soldier with tales of glory and honour in your heart, being thrust up against some of the most battle-hardened men on the planet, and if by some miracle you managed to survive, what you must have seen as your comrades has been shot down, blown up and bled out would certainly change you forever. In these battles, it's not often you would be instantly killed by a direct bullet or artillery hit. Often you would be hit in the body with some form of projectile, and you would bleed out and die slowly over a matter of minutes or hours. What would affect me most of all would be hearing the screams of men coming to terms with their death all around me, screams for their mothers, their homes, their wives, lovers and children. The screams of pain, the wailing as reality sinks in that life is ending here on this spot where they've been shot down. It would be an absolute PTSD-inducing event to witness. Now, we didn't have terms like PTSD back then, and it took the military brass on both sides a long time to acknowledge that a new phenomenon of this war, which was to become known as shell shock, was a real thing, and not just a feigned act of cowardice by the soldiers looking to shirk their duties. It became clear that men should be cycled off the front lines and brought to the rear from time to time, so they don't go insane. You can't just leave them out there under fire and heavy shelling without rest. Every man has his breaking point. And for the men who had been exposed to these situations numerous times and had lived, what type of men can this form? Well, one of the most monstrous men in history was at this battle, Adolf Hitler, and he would run out into no man's land amidst a hail of gunfire, pick up an injured officer and carry him back to the lines, managing to do this all unscathed. Ian Kershaw would write this in his biography about Hitler. Quote, "The First World War shaped Hitler profoundly, not just in terms of his political thinking, but in the way he perceived himself and his place in the world. It was a war that broke men in different ways. Some were scarred but continued, while others like Hitler seemed to be galvanised by it, shaped by the horrors and chaos into something else." End quote. Years later, from a prison cell, Hitler would write about the Battle of Ypres and the profound impact it had on him in his book Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. At last the day came when we left Munich to begin the fulfilment of our duty. For the first time I saw the Rhine as we rode westward along the waters to defend it. And then came a damp, cold night in Flanders, through which we marched in silence. And when the day began to emerge, from the mist, suddenly an iron greeting came whizzing at us from over our heads. With a sharp report, it sent its little pellets flying between our ranks, ripping up the wet ground. But even before the little cloud had passed, from 200 throats the first hurrah rose to meet the first messengers of death. Then a cracking, a roaring, a singing and a howling began, and with feverish eyes each one of us was drawn forward, faster and faster, until suddenly past turnip fields and hedges the fight began. The fight of man against man, and from the distance strains of a song reached our ears, coming closer and closer, leaping from company to company, just as death plunged a busy hand into our ranks. The song reached us too, and we passed it along. Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles in der Welt. 4 days later, we came back. Even our step had changed. 17-year-old boys now look like men. The volunteers of the List Regiment may not have learned how to fight properly, but they knew how to die like soldiers. This was the beginning. End quote. Here's another quote from a book that inspired the film All Quiet on the Western Front. It touches on that feeling of a loss of youth and having to grow up and harden up virtually overnight. This brilliant book was written by Erich Maria Remarque. Quote, "We are not youth any longer. We have lost all the things that youth has. We have lost the respect of the old, the idealism of the young, the enthusiasm of the untried. We have lost the belief that we are stronger, better and more noble than the other. We have only the reality, the dullness, the horror of war, which has left deep furrows in our brows." End quote. At Ypres, Germany suffered its fourth major defeat since September, a crushing blow that, following the Marne and the battle for Nancy and Yser, cemented the stalemate and ended any hope of a quick victory in the West. But Ypres was different. Unlike the others, it took on mythic proportions, with casualties exceeding 100,000, of which as many as 30,000 were dead. Perhaps it had to. November 11, 1914 became a date heavy with symbolism, tied to the story of these youthful regiments at Langemarck, which is just north of Ypres. Amid the declining enthusiasm of the troops themselves, this myth was forged out of a necessity. It was never meant for the trenches, where the soldiers had already seen the truth for what it was, but for the home front, and later after the war was lost, it found new life in the hands of the propagandists. Hitler and the Nazi Party invoked the memory of these martyrs to fuel their nationalist and racial agenda. Their commemoration of this event was set for the 11th of November, serving as a symbolic counterpoint to Armistice Day, which also fell on the 11th of November. A substitute for the bitterness the Germans felt over their defeat in the war. Now, by the time the guns fell silent over the fields of Ypres on the 22nd of November 1914, nearly 250,000 men lay dead, wounded or missing. British, French and German alike. The slaughter had locked the Western Front in place, a scar of trenches now stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea. But this was not the end, it was only the beginning. Ypres would be fought over again in 1915, and then again in 1917. Two more titanic struggles would stain the soil with even more blood, until by 1918 nearly 1 million casualties had been suffered in this single, cursed corner of Belgium. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had instead birthed something far worse, a pitiless industrial slaughter that would drag on for 4 more years. I want to finish now with 2 poems, and one from either side of the conflict. This first one by John McCrae, which would inspire one of the most enduring symbols of World War I for the Allies, that of the poppies that grew in Flanders fields. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below, we are the dead short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw, the torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep though poppies grow in Flanders fields. And this poem from the German side, Soldatenabschied, a soldier's farewell. It became a symbol of the Langemarck myth during the war, its authorship falsely attributed to Johann Wolfgang von Goethe to help fuel propaganda. But the true writer remains unknown. But his words captured the tragic resignation of a generation of boys sent to their deaths. Dawn, O dawn, do you shine upon my early death? Soon the trumpet will sound, then I must give my life, I and many a comrade. Dawn, O dawn, do you shine upon my early death? But before I go, I greet you, life, joy and sun. Look, you my only love, farewell.